The high plains are a lonely place to be a widow. Elara Hayes knew this in her bones, same as she knew the sting of the winter wind and the smell of chimney smoke. Her small ranch was a speck of defiant life in the vast, empty palm of the Wyoming Territory. But that isolation is shattered by a blizzard and by the man it spits out. A dying man collapses on her doorstep, a man with no words, only wounds. He is a silent warrior, a man whose past is etched in gunpowder and a grief as deep as her own. She gives him shelter. He gives her a new war. This is the story of a vow made in blood, and the widow who stood in its way. The wind hadn't stopped screaming for 2 days. It was the kind of wind that lived on the high plains of Wyoming Territory, a living entity that stole the heat from your bones and the hope from your heart. For Elara Hayes, the sound was a constant reminder of her solitude. Her ranch, the H-Bar-H, was nestled in a shallow dip near the banks of the Bitter Creek, a tributary that was, true to its name, more mud than water most of the year. The ranch was too small to be profitable and too large to be managed alone. Her late husband, Jebediah, had seen promise in this land. He'd seen the Bighorn Mountains touching the sky to the west and called it God's Anvil. But Jeb was gone 6 months now, victim of a freak cattle stampede, leaving Elara with a worn-out sod house, 30 head of lean longhorns, and a mortgage in the town of Prosperity Creek, held by a man who had no patience for widows. That man was Magnus Thorne. Thorne was a cattle baron, a man who believed in manifest destiny as long as he was the one manifesting it. He owned the bank, the sheriff, and most of the Sweetwater Valley, all except this one, stubborn Patch. Thorne wanted Elara's land, not for the sod, but for the water rights to the Bitter Creek, meager as it was. His foreman, a hard-eyed man named Caleb Jarvis, had made Thorne's intentions clear. "A woman alone has no business out here, Mrs. Hayes," Jarvis had sneered just last week, his tobacco-stained teeth matching the yellow of his eyes. "Mr. Thorne is prepared to be generous. Take the offer. Go back east where you belong." Elara had met his gaze, her hands tight on the shotgun she always carried. "The only place I belong, Mr. Jarvis, is on the land my husband died for. Now get off it." Jarvis had left, but his parting look was a promise of return. Now, the storm was her only company. It was late October, and the blizzard had come early, a thick, churning wall of white. She was checking the seals on her windows, stuffing rags into the cracks, when she saw it. At first, it was just a smudge, a dark inconsistency in the swirling white. A lost calf, perhaps. But as it staggered closer, the shape resolved. It was a man, half frozen, moving not with purpose but with the last, desperate momentum of the dying. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing nothing but a linen shirt and canvas trousers against the blizzard. He took 3 more steps, crashed into the half-buried fence line, and did not get up. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was Thorne's work. It had to be. A trick, a new way to break her. Jarvis had sent one of his thugs to test her, to play on her sympathies. "Stay inside, Elara," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's no business of yours." But then the wind peeled back for a second, and she saw the dark stain spreading across the man's right side, a patch of crimson melting the snow beneath him. "Damn it, Jeb," she cursed, grabbing her heavy wool cloak. "Damn you for leaving me to make these choices." She kicked the door open and plunged into the white hell. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. It took her nearly 5 minutes to fight the 20 yards to the fence. The man was unconscious, his face a mask of ice and frozen blood. He was heavy, A dead weight, but the hard years on the plains had given Ilara a wiry strength. She didn't try to lift him. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and dragged him, sliding his body over the frozen ground, back toward the small, warm square of light that was her home. She pulled him over the threshold, the storm clawing at her back, and slammed the door, shutting out the howl of the world. The man lay on her puncheon floor, a broken, silent thing. She lit a second lantern, her hands shaking. He was not one of Jarvis's men. She didn't recognize him at all. His face was sharp, with a strong jaw hidden beneath a dark, ragged beard. But it was the scar that held her attention, a white, puckered line that ran from his left temple down to his chin, crossing a faded tattoo of a coiled serpent on his neck. This was a hard man, a man who lived by the gun. She cut away his shirt. The wound was ugly. A bullet, fired from a distance, had torn through the flesh and muscle of his side. It was deep, and it was poisoned with dirt and frost. For a long moment, Ilara Hayes stood over him, the melting snow from his clothes puddling on her floor. She had every reason to let him die. He was trouble, a harbinger of violence. He was the world she had tried to escape with Jeb. But as she looked at his face, lost in a fever that was already taking hold, she saw something else. She saw the same exhaustion she felt every morning. She fetched the whiskey, the carving knife, and the needle. She heated the knife in the fireplace until it glowed red. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered, "both for what I'm about to do, and for what I'm letting into my home." The widow of the plains began to dig the lead from the silent warrior's side. He was delirious for 3 days. Ilara slept in the chair by the fire, the shotgun loaded on her lap. The storm raged, sealing them inside. The man, she had no name for him, thrashed in her bed, his fever dreams filled with fragments of violence. He shouted names she didn't know. "Daniel! Riley! The gold, it's not!" She forced broth and whiskey-laced water between his cracked lips. She changed the bandages, which soaked through with alarming speed. She saw the other scars, the pockmarks of old bullet wounds, the jagged map of knife work. This man's body was a ledger of old debts. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The world outside was a blinding, pristine white, and on the inside, the fever broke. Ilara was washing the grit from her hands in the basin when she heard a sound, the dry click of a hammer being cocked. She froze. Slowly she turned. The man was sitting up in her bed. He was pale, gaunt, and dripping sweat, but his eyes were clear, and they were pointed at her, as was the Colt Navy revolver he held with a shockingly steady hand. He must have had it tucked in his boot. "Where is it?" he rasped. His voice was like dry gravel. "Where is what?" Ilara said, keeping her hands open, away from the shotgun by the fireplace. "My gun belt, my rifle." "In the barn, dry, where your horse is." She'd found the horse, a half-dead Appaloosa, huddled in the leer of the barn on the 2nd day, and nursed it back to health. He stared at her, his eyes a cold, pale grey. He was assessing her. The house, the exits. "Who are you?" "Ilara Hayes. This is my land." "Why am I not dead?" "I've been asking myself the same question," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "You were shot. You stumbled here in the storm." He nodded, a short, sharp movement. He looked at his bandaged side, then back at her. He didn't lower the gun. "Who else?" "There is no one else, just me." The silence in the room was heavier than the snow outside. He held her gaze for a full minute, a silent battle of wills. Finally, with a grunt of pain, he lowered the hammer and let the revolver rest on his lap. "The water bucket is near empty." That was how their arrangement began. He did not offer a name, and she did not ask for one. She called him Mister. He called her Ma'am. For the next week, he healed with the unnatural speed of a wild animal. He moved from the bed to the chair, then from the chair to the porch. He remained silent, but his silence was not empty. It was watchful. He was a coiled spring. He began to work. He didn't ask. He simply saw what needed doing. He rehung the barn door, which the storm had battered. He split a week's worth of firewood, the thwack of the axe echoing in the clean, cold air. He moved with a brutal, economic efficiency. Elara would leave a plate of food on the porch. When she returned, the plate would be clean and the woodpile twice as high. She felt a strange tension. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was mingled with something else, a feeling she hadn't had since Jeb died. She wasn't alone. The truce was broken by the sound of approaching riders. Michael, as she had begun to call him in her mind, was in the barn, mending tack. Elara was sweeping the porch. She saw the two riders crest the ridge, and her stomach turned to ice. Caleb Jarvis, and with him, a new man, one she didn't recognize, thin and weasel-like, with a brace of pistols. Jarvis tipped his hat in mock courtesy, his eyes roving over the ranch, noting the split firewood, the mended fence. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes. Looks like you've been busy. Find yourself some hired help." "What do you want, Jarvis?" Elara said, her hand tightening on the broom handle. "Just a friendly visit. Mr. Thorne is a patient man, but this land is cluttered. He wants it clean." He dismounted, walking toward her, his spurs jingling a death knell. "He's authorized me to make you a final offer. $5 an acre. It's not for sale. Everything," Jarvis said, his voice dropping, "is for sale." He was close now, close enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath. He reached out and snagged a piece of her hair, which had come loose from its bun. "You're a fine-looking woman, Elara. A shame to see you all dried up out here." "Get your hand off me." "Or what? You gonna call for help?" He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "No." A low voice rumbled from the barn doorway. "She doesn't have to." Jarvis spun around. The weasel-like man went for his gun. The silent guest was standing there. He was unarmed, save for the heavy, four-tined pitchfork he held loosely in one hand. He hadn't shaved, and the dark beard and cold grey eyes made him look like a wolf roused from its den. "This is private property," the man said. His voice was calm, but it cut through the air. Jarvis's hand hovered over his own pistol. He was no coward, but he was a bully, and he recognized something in this stranger that he couldn't bully. He saw the scar, the snake tattoo, the absolute lack of fear. "And who in the hell are you?" Jarvis spat. The man took one step forward. The tines of the pitchfork glinted. "I'm the man mending the fence. You're standing on my workspace." The weasel man looked at Jarvis, his eyes wide. Jarvis looked at the stranger, at Elara, and back at the stranger. He saw a man who would kill him without a second thought, and then go back to mending the fence. Jarvis licked his lips, his bravado gone. "This ain't over, widow." He backed up, climbed onto his horse, and didn't look back. Elara watched them ride until they were dark specks. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. She turned to the stranger, who was still standing in the barn door, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, tossed the pitchfork into a hay bale, and went back to his work. But Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she hadn't just saved a man. She had armed a bomb, and Caleb Jarvis had just lit the fuse. That night, the fragile peace was shattered. Elara couldn't sleep. The confrontation with Jarvis had undone her. She was building a fire in the hearth, her hands trembling, when he spoke from the shadows of the porch. You should leave." Ilara jumped, clutching her robe. He was sitting on the steps, his rifle, her rifle, Jeb's old Winchester, across his lap. He'd been cleaning it. "Pardon me?" "He'll be back," Michael said, his voice flat. "Jarvis, he'll bring more men. You can't hold this place." "This is my home," Ilara said, anger replacing her fear. "I'm not running from a vulture like Jarvis." "He's not a vulture. He's a hyena, and he just saw a lion." He stood up and walked into the firelight. His face was a mask of grim calculation. "You saved my life, Mom. I won't see you lose yours for it." "Then tell me who you are." It burst out of her, a demand born of days of suspense. "I've fed you. I've patched your wounds. I've stood by you against men who want my land. I've earned a name." He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, the story tumbled out, a dark, rusted chain of events. "My name is Michael Vane," he said. He spoke of the war, not as a soldier, but as a scout, a pathfinder for the Union Army in the high, remote conflicts of the West. He spoke of betrayal, of leading a patrol into an ambush he should have seen, of being the only survivor. "After the war," he continued, his voice so low she had to lean in, "there was no work for a man like me, only other work." He'd fallen in with a crew, hard men, ex-soldiers like him. They weren't just petty outlaws, they were smart. They were run by a man named Black Jack Riley. Riley was a charismatic, brutal strategist, and with them was Michael's younger brother, Daniel. "Daniel," Michael said, and his voice broke just for a second. He was always soft. He followed me west. He had no business in that life, but he followed me. A year ago, Riley's gang had pulled a job that was too big. They'd hit the First National Bank in Cheyenne, a bank that held the U.S. Army payroll. They hadn't just stolen money, they'd stolen from the government. "We got away clean," Michael said, his eyes haunted. $500,000 in gold and new bills. We holed up in the Wind River Range, and that's when it went wrong. The Pinkertons were on them. The army was on them. The reward was huge. The gang started to fracture, and here, the first twist. Riley, he got paranoid. He thought one of us was going to turn, to take the gold and the pardon. He started seeing shadows. "But it wasn't the law he had to worry about," Ilara whispered. "No, it was me." Michael looked at her, his grey eyes burning. "Daniel couldn't take it. The guilt. He wanted to give his share back. He told me he was going to ride out, leave it for the marshals. I told him he was a fool, that Riley would kill him." Michael had tried to stop it. He'd confronted Riley, tried to buy Daniel's way out. But Riley saw the bond between the brothers as a threat. "He called a meeting," Michael said, his voice hardening into granite. "Said we were dividing the loot. He accused Daniel of being a traitor, of dealing with the Pinkertons. Before I could move, Riley shot him. My brother. He shot him in the chest and he laughed." Michael had gone blind with rage. He'd drawn his own gun, but the rest of the gang, loyal to Riley or just terrified of him, opened fire, 4 against 1. "They shot me in the side, the same wound you fixed. They took me for dead. Took my horse, my guns, everything. And they left me. They left me in a shallow grave next to my brother. He'd clawed his way out. He'd survived on grubs and instinct. He'd spent 6 months healing, hunting, and tracking." "That's who shot me, Mom," Michael concluded, his body rigid. "Not Jarvis. Not Thorne. It was Riley's men. I found them 2 weeks ago, near Casper. I wasn't careful enough. They ambushed me. I lost my horse, my gear. I got one of them, but they wounded me. I ran. I just ran south until the storm hit. And I hit your fence." Elara finally understood. The silence, the warrior. The man was not running from anything. He was hunting. "So, the vow," she said, her mind racing. "The one you shouted in your fever." Michael Vane stood to his full height, the firelight catching the serpent tattoo on his neck. His face was a terrible thing to behold, a mask of pure, righteous fury. "Riley has the gold. He has my brother's blood on his hands. He thinks I'm dead." He turned to Elara, and his vow, when he spoke it, was not a shout. It was a cold, quiet promise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. "I am going to find Black Jack Riley. I am going to take back my brother's honor, and I am going to put him in the ground." The silence that followed was absolute. Elara Hayes, the widow of the plains, had sheltered a man whose sole purpose was vengeance, and she knew that his vow, spoken in her home, had just echoed across the mountains, calling his enemies down upon them both. The town of Prosperity Creek was little more than a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings. Its heart was the Gilded Pig Saloon, and its dark soul was the office of Magnus Thorne. Thorne was not a mustache-twirling villain. He was a businessman. He wore tailored suits from Chicago and believed the West was a wild garden that needed a firm, commercial hand to prune it. And Elara Hayes was a weed in his garden. Caleb Jarvis stormed into Thorne's office, his face still red with humiliation. "He had a man, Mr. Thorne, a new man, hard, looks like a damn gunman." Thorne didn't look up from his ledger. "Everyone looks hard to you these days, Caleb. Did you make the offer?" "I did." She refused. "And this new man, he threatened me. With a pitchfork of all the—" "A pitchfork," Thorne said, finally looking up. His eyes were as flat and grey as a dollar coin. "You were run off by a farmhand." "He ain't no farmhand. He had a snake tattoo on his neck, a scar. He looked like he'd killed men." Thorne leaned back, steepling his fingers. "A scar. A snake tattoo. That does complicate things. A woman alone is a tragedy. A woman protected is a negotiation. Find out who he is. I will not be stopped by some two-bit drifter." Jarvis left, his orders clear. He headed to the Gilded Pig. He found his weasel-like associate, a man named Weasel Pete, playing cards. "Pete," Jarvis said, sliding into the chair, "I need you to ride to Cheyenne. Ask questions. A man, tall, dark hair, scar on his face, snake on his neck. Find out who he is." "That's a 100-mile ride," Pete whined. Jarvis slammed a silver dollar on the table. "And that's $1. Imagine the 5 I'll give you when you're back. Now ride." Pete rode. For 3 days, an uneasy quiet settled over the H-Bar-H ranch. Michael worked, his movements sharp, almost frantic. He was fortifying the ranch. He dug a new trench near the creek bed, giving them a firing position with a clear view of the ridge. He boarded up the north-facing window of the house. Elara watched him, her heart a confusion of fear and a strange, unwelcome admiration. He was a killer. He was a man of vengeance. But he was also the first man since Jeb who had treated her with a kind of practical respect. He didn't coddle her. He handed her a rifle. "You're shooting high," he said one afternoon, his voice short. They were checking the property line. "You're anticipating the kick. Don't. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Let it surprise you." She fired again. The bullet struck the tin can he'd set on a rock, sending it flying. She looked at him, surprised at her own small victory. A faint, almost smile touched his lips. "Good. Do it again." That night, as they ate a quiet meal of beans and stale bread, Elara found her voice. "What happens after, Michael? After you find Riley?" He stopped, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "There is no after. This is the only thing." "That's not true," she said softly. "You survived. You could build a life. This vengeance, it will eat you alive." "It's the only thing keeping me alive, Mom," he said, and the finality in his tone shut the conversation down. Meanwhile, Weasel Pete was returning from Cheyenne, and he had a story that was worth far more than $5. He found Jarvis not at the saloon, but at Thorne's office. Magnus Thorne himself listened, as Pete, shivering with excitement, laid out his findings. "He ain't just a gunman, Mr. Thorne," Pete said, his eyes wide. "He's Michael Vane, the Michael Vane. He was part of Black, Jack Riley's crew, the ones who hit the army payroll." Thorne's eyes lit up. This was not a complication. This was an opportunity. "Go on," Thorne said. "Well, the story is, Vane and his brother tried to double-cross Riley. Riley killed the brother, and Vane disappeared. He's presumed dead. But Pinkerton circulars, they say Vane was the brains. They say he's the only one who knows where the gold is buried. Riley's been hunting him. The Pinkerton's been hunting him. And he's been hiding out as a farmhand for the widow." Jarvis was stunned. "The gold?" Thorne was not. He was already 5 steps ahead. "Caleb, this changes everything. The widow's land is irrelevant. This is a far bigger prize." And here, the second twist. "Jarvis," Thorne said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "You said Black. Jack Riley was hunting Vane. That's what Pete here says." "Then we will be good citizens," Thorne said smoothly. "We will deliver Mr. Vane to Mr. Riley, an outlaw gang and a bank-robbing gunman, all converging on one small, isolated ranch. It seems providential." Jarvis looked confused. "You want to help Riley?" "I want the gold, you fool. We'll contact Riley. We know where Vane is. He doesn't. We'll set a trap. We'll let Riley's gang do the hard work of killing Vane. In the chaos, Vane's protector, the widow, will be tragically killed. And in the aftermath, we will persuade Mr. Riley to share his good fortune in gratitude for our information. Or perhaps Mr. Riley will also meet with an unfortunate accident, leaving us the sole beneficiaries." Caleb Jarvis finally smiled. It was a slow, cruel expression. "And I know just how to find Riley. His crew was last seen moving through the Bighorn Pass, heading this way." "Then go," Thorne commanded. "Go find him. Tell him we have a mutual friend who needs tending to. Tell him the widow of the plains is sheltering her husband's killer." It was a lie, but it was a good one. Thorne knew that, in the West, you didn't need the truth. You just needed a story that was believable enough to get men to kill for you. The alliance was struck in a dusty, wind-swept canyon 30 miles north of Prosperity Creek. Caleb Jarvis, riding under a white flag, met with a man who looked more like a grim preacher than an outlaw. Black Jack Riley was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to burn from within. He listened, impassive, as Jarvis laid out Thorne's proposition. "Michael Vane," Riley said, the name a curse on his lips. "He's alive." "Alive and well," Jarvis said, "and shacked up with a widow on the Bitter Creek. He's fortified the place. My boss, Mr. Thorne, has a disagreement with the widow. We want her gone. You want Vane." "And the gold?" Riley's voice was a dead calm. "Vane has a map." "We don't care about the map," Jarvis lied smoothly. "We just want the land. We'll help you draw him out. You and your men take Vane, we take the widow, and everyone gets what they want." Riley stared at Jarvis for a long time. "Vane was my partner. He's a snake. You're a snake. I don't trust snakes." "You don't have to trust us," Jarvis said. "You just have to trust that we want that woman off her land, more than you want Vane dead. We'll ride with you. Tonight." Riley nodded, once. Tonight? Back at the H-Bar-H, the world had shrunk to the four walls of the sod house. A new, fragile intimacy had formed between Elara and Michael. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion, but of shared burden. He watched her mend the shirt he'd been shot in. Her hands, rough from ranch work, were surprisingly gentle with the needle. "Jebediah," she said quietly, not looking up. "My husband. He loved this land. He said it was the only place he could breathe." "It's hard land," Michael said, cleaning his revolver. "It is. But it's honest. The wind doesn't lie. The cold doesn't lie. Not like men do." She paused, then looked him in the eye. "You're not the only one who's lost a brother, Michael. Jeb was. He was my rock. When he died, I thought the wind would just blow me away." "It didn't," Michael said. "No, it didn't. I'm stronger than I thought." She tied off the thread. "And so are you. You're more than just that vow." He had no answer for that. The change came not from the north, where Riley was, but from the east, from Prosperity Creek. A lone rider. Michael was in the barn, his hand on his rifle, before the man was even halfway to the house. "Stay inside, Elara." But Elara stepped onto the porch. "I know him. That's Marshal Vance. Eli Vance." Michael froze. "A marshal? He's the real law, Michael, not Thorne's man. He's a federal marshal." This was the third twist. The law had finally arrived. But whose side was it on? Marshal Eli Vance was an older man, with a kind, weathered face and a star on his vest that was polished but not new. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the boarded-up window, the trench, and the hard-looking man in the barn doorway. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, tipping his hat. "A pleasure, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Marshal, what brings you out here?" Elara asked. "I've been in town for a week, Mum, asking quiet questions. I'm building a case against Magnus Thorne." Elara and Michael exchanged a look. "Thorne?" Elara said. "For what?" "For everything," Vance said, his voice tired. "Illegal land grabs, cattle rustling, extortion, using the local law as his own private army. I've been tracking him for months. His man, Jarvis, has been overzealous. People are finally willing to talk. I came out to see if you'd be one of them." Elara looked at Michael. Vance's gaze shifted to the silent man. "And who might you be, sir? I don't believe we've been introduced." Michael Vane stepped out of the shadow. He did not wear his gun belt. "He's my hired hand, Marshal," Elara said quickly. A friend of my late husband's, Mr. Smith." Vance looked at Michael, his eyes sharp. He looked at the scar, at the tattoo. The Marshal had seen a lot of Mr. Smiths in his day. "Mr. Smith," Vance said, his voice neutral. "You've been doing a fine bit of carpentry. Looks more like you're expecting a siege than a winter." "Mr. Thorne's foreman paid Mrs. Hayes a visit," Michael said, his voice steady. "We thought it prudent?" Vance nodded, his face grim. "It was. I've heard rumors. That's why I'm here. I believe Thorne is planning to move against you, to burn you out. I want to offer you protection. You and Mr. Smith. You should come back to town." "I'm not leaving my ranch," Elara said, her chin set. "And I'm not leaving her," Michael added. Vance sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that. Then I'm staying, at least for the night. I have 2 deputies back in Prosperity Creek, but I sent for a full company of cavalry from Fort Laramie. They'll be here in 3 days. All we have to do is hold out." He looked from Elara to Michael. "But I have a feeling, Mrs. Hayes, that your trouble isn't just with Magnus Thorne. Is there something you want to tell me, Mr. Smith?" Michael met the marshal's gaze. "My name is Michael Vane." The marshal's face went pale. "Vane, as in Riley's gang, the Cheyenne payroll." "The same," Michael said. "I have a warrant for your arrest, son," Vance said, his hand slowly moving toward his sidearm. "I know," Michael said, "and I'll go with you, willingly. But you need to know, Black Jack Riley is alive, and he's hunting me. And Magnus Thorne, his man Jarvis just rode out to find Riley." The air went dead cold. "What?" Vance whispered. "Thorne is setting a trap," Ilara said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. "He's not just burning me out. He's bringing an entire outlaw gang here. He's planning to kill us all." Marshal Vance looked at Michael Vane, the outlaw. He looked at Ilara Hayes, the victim. He looked at the setting sun, which was painting the ridges a deep, bloody red. "God help us," Vance said, pulling his rifle from his saddle. "It's not just a siege, it's a war." The light was dying. The cold, high plains twilight settled over the ranch, turning the white snow to a deathly blue. There were 3 of them, a widow, an outlaw, and a single, aging marshal. "They'll come from the ridge," Michael said, his voice all business. He was no longer a farmer or a fugitive. He was the scout he'd once been. "They'll have the high ground, but the creek bed, that's our advantage." "The house is a death trap," Vance agreed. "Sod walls are good against bullets, but fire, they'll burn us out." "We don't stay in the house," Michael said. He pointed to the small fortified trench he'd dug near the creek, hidden by a line of scrub. "It's small, but it's deep. It gives us a clear line of fire to the house and the barn." "What good does that do?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling as she loaded Jeb's shotgun. "They don't know we're not in the house," Michael said, a grim light in his eyes. "They'll attack the building. We'll be behind them." It was a desperate, brilliant plan. "Marshal," Michael said, handing him one of the 2 repeating rifles. "You and Mrs. Hayes take the trench. I'll take the barn." "The barn," Vance said. "That's a tinderbox, son. It's also got a hayloft. Gives me elevation. I can cover your flank. They'll split their force, 1 for the house, 1 for the barn. You'll only have to fight half of them. And you'll have to fight the other half." "Alone," Ilara said, her heart seizing. "I fought worse odds," Michael said. It was not a boast. It was a fact. Vance looked at the man he was supposed to arrest. He nodded. "Godspeed, Mr. Vane." Michael grabbed a satchel, loading it with ammunition. He paused at the door, looking back at Ilara. He didn't say, "Be safe." He didn't say, "Goodbye." He just met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the vow. But it had changed. It was no longer just for his brother. He slipped out into the darkness. Ilara and Marshal Vance made their way to the trench. The cold was brutal. They lay on the frozen dirt, the smell of alkaline soil filling their nostrils, and they waited. An hour passed, then 2. The only sound was the wind, whistling a funeral dirge. "Maybe they're not coming," Ilara whispered. "They're coming," Vance said. "They're just waiting for the moon to set." And as if summoned by his words, the first shadow appeared on the ridge. Then another, and another. A dozen riders, black shapes against the starlit sky. They dismounted, moving with a practiced, predatory silence. Ilara could make out 2 distinct groups. One, led by a tall, gaunt man, Riley, moved toward the house. The other, led by Caleb Jarvis, moved toward the barn. "Just as he said," Vance whispered. "Hold your fire. Wait until they're in the open." Jarvis and his men, 6 of Thorne's hired thugs, kicked open the barn door. "He's in here, boys. Burn him out." They were expecting a cornered rat. They weren't expecting a lion from above. The first shot came from the hayloft, a blossom of orange fire. One of Jarvis's men crumpled. A second shot. A third. Michael Vane was working the lever of the Winchester, like a machine. "Ambush!" Jarvis screamed, diving behind a water trough. At the same moment, Riley's crew reached the house. "Vane! Come out, Vane! I've got a gift for your brother!" "Now!" Vance shouted. He and Ilara opened fire. From the trench they had a perfect, devastating angle on Riley's flank. The outlaws, caught between the empty house and the sudden gunfire from their rear, panicked. "It's a trap!" one shouted, clutching his leg. Black. Jack Riley, a veteran of 100 such fights, didn't panic. He saw the muzzle flashes from the trench. He saw the fighting at the barn. And he understood. "It's Vane!" he roared. "He split us! To the creek! Kill them! Kill them all!" The night exploded. Gunfire echoed from the barn. A desperate, close-quarters battle. Jarvis and his men were pinned down by Michael's superior position. But Riley and his men were focused on the trench. Bullets zipped over Ilara's head, thudding into the dirt bank. "Reloading!" Vance yelled, fumbling with cartridges. A figure broke from the chaos, running straight at them. Ilara raised her shotgun, her hands shaking, and fired. The man fell, screaming. She felt a wave of nausea, but she didn't hesitate. She pumped the shotgun and fired again. This was her land. This was her home. Suddenly, a new sound, a terrible, hungry whoosh. "Fire!" Vance yelled. Caleb Jarvis, in a desperate move, had set the barn alight. Flames licked up the dry wood, turning the night sky red. "Michael!" Ilara screamed. The firing from the hayloft stopped. "He's got to get out," Vance said, his face grim. "He's trapped." "No," Ilara whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. Jarvis and his surviving men, laughing, emerged from behind the trough, their guns trained on the flaming barn doors. They were waiting for Michael to be flushed out, a burning, easy target. The vow, Ilara thought. His vow. And that's when it happened. The main door of the barn exploded outward, but Michael Vane did not run out. His Appaloosa horse, screaming in terror, burst from the flames. And on its back, lying low, was Michael. He was out of the fire and into the frying pan. "There he is!" Jarvis bellowed. But Jarvis had forgotten about Riley, and Black Jack Riley had just seen his partner, his betrayer, his single-minded obsession, appear in the firelight. This was the final, bloody twist. Riley, who had been focused on the trench, saw Michael, and his vow overrode his temporary alliance with Thorn. "He's mine, you sod-busting fool!" Riley roared, and he swiveled, firing not at Michael, but at Caleb Jarvis. The bullet caught Jarvis in the chest. He looked down, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Thorn's men, seeing their leader fall and finding themselves between a burning barn, a vengeful outlaw, and a federal marshal, did the only sensible thing. They broke. They ran for their horses. But Riley's men were not ranchers. They were killers. They turned with their leader. A full-blown, three-way war erupted in the ranch yard. It was Riley's outlaws versus Thorn's collapsing crew versus the trench. Michael Vane rolled off the horse, his arm bleeding, his face blackened with soot. He came up with his revolver in hand. He had no more vengeance for Jarvis. He had no interest in the marshal. He had eyes for only one man. "Riley!" he roared, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "Black!" Jack Riley turned. The world narrowed to the 50 yards between the two men. The war that had started in the Wind River Mountains was ending here, in a widow's burning ranch yard. "You should have stayed dead, Michael!" Riley yelled, raising his pistol. "This is for Daniel!" Michael bellowed. Both men fired. Riley's shot went wide, the bullet singing past Michael's ear. Michael's shot was true. It struck Black Jack Riley, square in the chest. The outlaw leader looked down, much as Jarvis had, as if surprised the vow had finally been paid. He fell to his knees and then pitched forward into the snow. The fighting stopped. The sudden, deafening silence was broken only by the crackle of the burning barn and the moans of the wounded. Silas Vane stood, swaying, his gun empty, over the body of his nemesis. He looked at the dead man, and for the first time in a year, his face was not filled with rage. It was empty. The vow was complete, and the warrior was lost. Mr. Vane, Marshal Eli Vance, stepped out of the trench, his rifle trained on Michael. Elara was right behind him, her shotgun still smoking. "It's over, son," Vance said, his voice heavy. Michael let his revolver fall from his numb fingers. He raised his hands. "It's over." Vance walked forward, pulling out his handcuffs. He looked at the carnage. Dead men from 2 different outfits. The corpse of Black Jack Riley. The mortally wounded Caleb Jarvis, gurgling his last breaths. "You have," a new voice said, "been very, very busy." A dozen men on horseback, wearing the blue of the U.S. cavalry, rode into the yard, their sabers and rifles gleaming in the firelight. The company from Fort Laramie. They were 3 days early. "Marshal?" a young captain asked, his eyes wide. "Secure the prisoners, Captain," Vance said, snapping the cuffs on Michael Vane's wrists. "All of them." He pointed to the surviving, wounded members of both gangs. Elara rushed forward. "Marshal, wait! He saved us! He saved you! You saw what happened!" "I did, Mrs. Hayes," Vance said, his voice kind but firm. "I saw a man defend this ranch. I saw him defend his own life. But I also have a warrant for Michael Vane for the Cheyenne payroll robbery. My vow," he said, touching his star, "is to the law." Michael looked at Elara. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just nodded. "It's all right, Elara," he said, using her name for the first time. "It's all right." As the cavalrymen began rounding up the wounded, Marshal Vance looked at the body of Caleb Jarvis. "This man worked for Magnus Thorne. I have a feeling," he said, looking at the captain, "that when we ride into Prosperity Creek at dawn, Mr. Thorne will have a great many questions to answer." The reign of the cattle baron was over. The vow of the silent warrior was complete. But as Elara Hayes watched the soldiers lead Michael Vane away, his shoulders slumped not in defeat, but in sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion. She knew his fight was just beginning, and she realized, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that so was hers. The trial was held in Cheyenne, in a courtroom packed to the rafters. The charges against Michael Vane were read: bank robbery, conspiracy, and resisting arrest. The prosecutor painted him as a cunning, violent animal. Magnus Thorne, his empire collapsing, had testified against Michael in a desperate bid for leniency, painting him as the mastermind behind everything. But then, the defense called its only witness. Elara Hayes walked to the stand. She was not the trembling widow from the plains. She was dressed in her simple, best black, her head held high. "They called him a silent warrior," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the quiet room. "But I saw him. I saw a man haunted by a brother's death and a betrayal he did not deserve. He did not come to my ranch for shelter. He came to die. I'm the one who didn't let him." She told them everything. About Jarvis, about Thorne, about the siege. She told them about Riley's vow of greed and Michael's vow of family. "Michael Vane did not resist arrest, Marshal Vance," she said, looking directly at the marshal, who sat in the front row. "He waited for it. He protected the law. He protected my home, and he protected me, knowing it would cost him his freedom." "He is a bank robber," the prosecutor shouted. "He is a man," Elara countered, her voice ringing. and he is the only man who stood by my side when your entire civilized world tried to burn me to the ground. If that is a crime, then we are all lost." The courtroom was silent. The verdict, when it came, was a compromise of the West. Michael Vane was found guilty of association with known felons, his time with Riley's gang. But he was acquitted of the robbery and the violence, his actions at the H-Bar-H ranch seen as self-defense. Marshal Eli Vance had testified that without Vane, he and Mrs. Hayes would be dead. The judge, a hard-bitten man who had seen it all, sentenced Michael Vane to 3 years in the territorial prison. For 3 years, Elara Hayes worked the H-Bar-H, but she was not alone. The townsfolk of Prosperity Creek, free from Thorn's thumb, saw her as a hero. They helped her rebuild the barn, stronger this time. They helped her brand her cattle. The ranch didn't just survive, it thrived. She never missed a visiting day. On a warm spring morning, Elara Hayes stood on her porch, watching the sun rise over the Bighorn Mountains. She heard a sound, the steady, familiar gait of a single horse. A rider came up the path. He was thinner, and the snake on his neck was faded by the sun. He stopped his horse at the fence line. He wore no guns. He looked at the new barn, the healthy cattle, the woman on the porch. "You're shooting high, ma'am," Michael Vane said, his voice rough. "That new fence post is 2 inches off true." Elara smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Then I suppose," she said, "it's a good thing I finally found some decent hired help." He dismounted, walked to the porch and took off his hat. The vow of vengeance was gone. The silence was gone. All that was left was the man. "Michael," she said. "Elara," he replied. He was home. The West wasn't just won by bullets. It was won by grit. It was built by survivors like Elara Hayes and redeemed by men like Michael Vane, men searching for one last, quiet piece of redemption. Their story is a story of the real frontier, a place where a single act of kindness could change a destiny, and where a vow could echo from the plains all the way to the mountains. If this story of survival, betrayal, and unbreakable spirit gripped your heart, please show your support. It helps us keep these histories alive. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a true Western drama, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of the West. We want to know, what part of Elara and Michael's fight stayed with you the most? Was it the siege? The trial? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for riding with us today.